Hello, this is Mr. Hunt. So, reviewing over the Japanese American cases, A Disaster. This was an article written by Eugene Rostow in 1945. So, this was written during the time that the war was still occurring. So, this is the abstract, and I will read it directly to you. Our wartime treatment of Japanese aliens and citizens of Japanese descent on the West Coast has been hasty, unnecessary, and mistaken. The course of action which we undertook was in no way required or justified by the circumstances of the war. It was calculated to produce both individual injustice and deep-seated social maladjustments of a cumulative and sinister kind. So in this section here, the author is going to be describing the treatment of Japanese aliens and citizens. Aliens meaning non-residents, not non-citizens, that are going to be residing in the West Coast, primarily California. And he's saying that it's mistaken, it's unnecessary, and it was done too quickly. And he says that it's not justified. World War II did not call for this action. And he, ascribes a motive to it to produce injustice, as well as, further problems that he describes as sinister. So, the internment of the West Coast Japanese is the worst blow to our liberties. Is the worst blow our liberties have sustained in many years. Over 100,000 men, women, and children have been imprisoned, some 70,000 of them citizens of the United States, without indictment or the proffer of charges pending inquiry into their loyalty. They were taken into custody as a military measure on the ground that espionage and sabotage were especially to be feared from persons of Japanese blood. They were removed from the West Coast area because the military thought it would take too long to conduct individual loyalty investigations on the ground. They were arrested in an area where the courts were open and freely functioning. They were held under prison conditions in uncomfortable camps, far from their homes and for lengthy periods, several years in many cases. If found disloyal in administrative proceedings, they were confined indefinitely, although no statute makes disloyalty a crime. It would be difficult indeed for a statute to do that under a constitution which has been interpreted to minimize imprisonment for political opinions, both by defining the crime of treason in extremely rigid and explicit terms, and by limiting convictions for sedition and the like offenses. In the course of relocation, citizens have suffered severe property losses, despite some custodial assistance by the government. Perhaps 70,000 persons are still in camps, loyal and disloyal citizens and aliens alike, more than 3 years after the programs were instituted. Although the process of relocation has recently been accelerated, many will remain in the camps until January 2nd, 1946. So the main points that I want you to get out of this is that during the time that these camps are in existence, there are people. Eugene Rostow is a professor. He's going to be prominent at Yale. But during the time that these camps are in existence, there are people who are criticizing them, noting that it's, primarily racism that will be attributing espionage and sabotage as likely actions of the Japanese, and noting that they could be tried in the courts that existed. There were courts in California, obviously, and the Japanese Americans could have gone there, but instead they're being held in uncomfortable camps, and that 70% of them are citizens of the United States. So these are citizens of the U.S. who are not being treated in the way that our Constitution, most would interpret today as being, they're not being granted the rights that our Constitution would give them. Since he's writing during the time that the camps still exist, he's saying that many are going to be remaining into the camps until January 2nd, 1946, and indeed many do. They will be in the camps until even after the war has ended. Going over to the Japanese American cases, a bigger disaster than we realized. The author of this is Eric Mueller. So he is going to be looking back at the original cases that Rostow was looking at, and he's going to be noting Rostow's papers. He will be looking at these as being a bigger disaster than we realize by looking at some of the other court cases. So in the court case Ex parte Endo, the court unanimously rejected the government's claim that it had the authority to continue to detain loyal American citizens of Japanese ancestry. So one thing I want you to note is this court case is decided by the Supreme Court on the same days as the Korematsu case. Um, so the same group of people are going to unanimously, my apologies, reject the government's claim in the Endo case, whereas they will not do so in the Korematsu case. In the Korematsu case, they will rule against Korematsu. Note this rather famous quote here, that the greatest danger to the Japanese American cases is that they would lie about like a loaded weapon ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of urgent need. So in this dissent, he's saying that this court case is going to potentially be a threat to the liberties of Americans in the future, if an authority figure can bring forward a plausible claim of urgent need, that there's an issue. So the author, Eric Mueller, is then going to be listing other cases. So the government is going to, try to enforce a military curfew, exclusion detention orders, and they will do well in that. But there's also going to be litigation involving criminal prosecutions of Japanese Americans for serving as unregistered agents of Japan, meaning people who worked for the Japanese consulate, who did translation work for the Japanese government, they are going to be prosecuted, and the government will fail in these prosecutions. Criminal prosecutions of Japanese Americans for counseling non-compliance with the government orders. There were some, Japanese Americans who said, it's not right for you to be drafted while we're in internment camps. And the second sentence notes the same. And some of these Japanese Americans said, I would willingly join the military if my family was not being imprisoned for no reason. And the U.S. will try to prosecute these individuals, saying they're refusing draft orders. But the courts are going to side in their favor, in the favor of the Japanese Americans who refuse to be drafted, on the basis that the internment, precluded their ability to be held to the standard that they could be drafted. As well, litigation to enforce Japanese Americans' coerced renunciation of their American citizenship. So this is litigation, remember, just refers to legal action, action done in courts. And so the government's going to be trying to uphold the renunciations, or the Americans who said, I no longer want to be an American citizen. So during World War II, Japanese Americans, some of whom were in internment camps, gave up their American citizenship, but they did so under coercion. They did so under duress. They did so while they were imprisoned. So if you are being held in improper conditions and you are being told or somewhat forced to do something, the papers you sign during that are not going to be upheld later, and the government will not be upholding these renunciations. They will say, the Japanese Americans who gave up their citizenship while at internment camps do have a claim to have these renunciations annulled, and they should, continue to be allowed to be American citizens if they so choose. So, seeing the larger body of Japanese American cases does not require us to abandon Rostow's conviction that the Supreme Court cases were a substantive disaster. But it does help us see that Japanese American cases of World War II were also a disaster of a different sort, a litigative disaster. So they're going to be a disaster in the courts themselves. They were in the main a failure. The government will be losing many of the cases that I specifically listed. So do note, in Endo, in ex parte Endo, you're going to have the government siding with the Japanese American versus the Korematsu and Hirabayashi cases, where the U.S. Supreme Court will be siding with the government's case. So in the main part of this article, obviously there's about 70 pages being excluded in this section between the introduction and conclusion. The government's going to win in cases where it says we have a dire military emergency. However, in many of the other cases, many of which don't reach the Supreme Court, the government will be losing those cases. And this is important because, you see the federal courts not being used by the executive branch to do things that are, somewhat against the Constitution. Having a program of racial suspicion and repression during a time of crisis. And this is important because, in the modern day, there are sometimes new suspicion with new racial and religious groups. And it should be noted, that the U.S. has seen issues such as this before, and it is good to be knowledgeable of them.